They were just 6-year-old girls, selling donuts on a cold street, begging strangers to save their mother. But when a millionaire CEO stopped his car, and asked why they were crying, he never imagined the answer would break him, and rewrite his entire life. You won't believe who their mother really is, and what he discovers next will melt your heart. Stay with me till the end. This is one of the most emotional stories you'll ever hear. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Let's see who's joining this journey across the world. The morning air in New York carried a cruel chill, but nothing compared to the quiet ache in the hearts of the two little girls standing on the unforgiving sidewalk with a tray of untouched donuts. Lily, in her sharp pink frock, gripped the edge of the tray while Lacey, in her bright yellow dress, held her sister's free hand tightly, both shivering not just from the cold but from fear, hunger, and helplessness. Their blue eyes scanned the faces that rushed past them, eyes that were too young to understand the weight of suffering yet far too used to being overlooked. "Please, just take one," Lily whispered, her voice so soft it barely reached the wind. "Your taste, your kindness might give our mommy a new life." But the crowd didn't slow down, didn't even glance. Some glanced and quickly looked away. Some grimaced. A businessman on a call pushed past, almost knocking Lacey off balance. A mother tugged her child to the other side of the sidewalk as if the innocence of these girls was something to fear. Lacey blinked back tears, trying to stay strong like mommy always told them, but the ache inside her chest was growing unbearable. Their legs were tired, their stomachs empty, and their spirits bruised from hearing no far more times than any 6-year-old ever should. Yet they stayed. They stayed because every second counted, every dollar mattered, and every donut unsold brought them closer to losing her. Their mother. Their everything. The hospital had warned them last night, if the bill wasn't paid soon, treatment would stop. She might not make it. Lily looked up, clutching the tray tighter as a tall man approached but turned away the moment he saw them. "Is it the donuts? Or us?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her voice cracked. Lacey sniffled and wiped her nose on her sleeve. "Don't cry," Lily tried to say, but her own tears betrayed her. Then suddenly, across the street, a sleek black car pulled over. The door opened, polished shoes hit the pavement, and a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, voice crisp and commanding. It was Ethan Blacone of New York's most powerful millionaire CEOs, known for his ruthless deals and colder-than-ice heart. He was pacing, barking orders, eyes scanning the skyline until they landed on them. On the two fragile figures trembling on the corner. He stopped mid-sentence. Something struck him, like an invisible hand to the chest. The donuts? Number? The dresses? Number? It was their eyes. Those impossibly blue, soul-deep, tear-filled eyes. For a moment, his world muted. The city noise blurred. The wind slowed. And all he could hear was the tiny echo of Lily's whisper as he stepped closer, slowly lowering his phone. "Please, sir," Lacey said, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and desperation, "you can taste one if you want. It's not about the money, it's for our mommy. She's really sick. They said she might." Her lips stopped moving as her voice failed her. Lily stepped forward with what little courage she had left. "Please, we don't want her to go to heaven yet." Ethan's chest rose and fell as something sharp and unrelenting gripped him from the inside. He looked at the tray, at the trembling hands holding it, then back at those tear-drenched cheeks and trembling lips. They looked like they hadn't eaten in days. But more than that, they looked like they'd lost all faith in kindness. And somehow, seeing that broke something in him. Not out of pity, but out of something deeper, something hauntingly familiar. He knelt slowly, for once in his life without thinking about creases on his expensive suit or the image he projected. He knelt, eye level with two tiny warriors standing against the cruel world with nothing but sweetness and hope in their hands. "Why are you weeping, sweethearts?" he asked softly, barely recognizing the warmth in his own voice. Lily looked up with wide, desperate eyes. "Because we don't want to lose her, our mommy. We don't have anyone else. And they won't help her if we don't pay." Ethan's throat tightened. Lacey stepped closer and added, "She always says we're her sunshine, but she's the one who makes the light." His eyes burned with emotion he hadn't felt in years. His business call forgotten, his meeting missed, his schedule irrelevant. All that mattered were these two fragile hearts standing before him, offering him donuts in exchange for hope. A world that once revolved around power and numbers now tilted toward something pure and aching. The tray of donuts trembled in Lily's hands. And Ethanon, of the richest men in the city, suddenly realized he had never felt poorer than he did in that moment, staring at two little girls selling sweetness in the name of survival, with no guarantee they'd see their mother alive again. Ethan's voice barely escaped his lips as he knelt on the cold pavement before the trembling girls, his business phone forgotten somewhere in his coat pocket, silenced by the weight of their presence, the innocence in their shivering hands, the sorrow etched into their tiny faces. The moment he asked why they were crying, he didn't expect the answer to hit like a blade wrapped in silk. Lacey, her lip quivering, clutched her sister's fingers and whispered with the quiet agony of a child forced to grow up too fast, "Mommy's in the hospital, and they said if we don't pay, they'll stop helping her." The words, simple as they were, sliced through him with unbearable sharpness. Ethan's breath caught, his heartbeat stuttered, and something long buried inside him twisted violently, an ache that had no name but felt all too familiar. Lily, blinking away tears, added with childlike earnestness, "We're not bad girls, we just want to keep our mommy alive." Her voice cracked under the weight of truth, and Ethan, who'd built empires from logic and control, suddenly found both slipping from his grasp. In their eyes, he saw desperation, but also bravery, the kind of courage he hadn't known since his own childhood, before boardrooms, before betrayal, before the loneliness wealth never cured. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, his voice raw. "Since early morning," Lacey murmured. "We didn't want to be late, they said she might not make it through the night." Her words left his soul winded. He looked at their tray, now nearly empty because of him, not customers. "Did you eat anything today?" he asked quietly. They shook their heads. "We're saving every cent for Mommy's medicine," Lily said, trying to smile, but failing as her lower lip trembled again. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry, heart beginning to race with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself in years: helplessness. These children weren't just surviving, they were sacrificing. And for what? For a mother lying alone in a hospital bed, unaware that her daughters were battling the cruelty of the world on her behalf. Ethan's hand, trembling more than he liked, reached out to gently brush a strand of hair from Lacey's forehead. She flinched, but then leaned into his touch, as if starved for kindness. "What's your mommy's name?" he asked. "Emily Grace," Lily replied, as if the name itself was a lifeline. Ethan's stomach flipped, but he kept his expression still, even as a ghost of something familiar stirred at the edge of his memory. Emily. The name felt carved into his bones, but he couldn't place why not yet. Lacey wiped her face and tried to stand taller. "She always tells us to be brave. So we're being brave, even if it's really, really hard." Ethan looked at them, at the way they held hands, the way they spoke as if their mother's life was a flame they were shielding from the wind. The world blurred around him, his schedule, his phone, his meetings, his chauffeur waiting nearby. None of it mattered compared to the storm unfolding in these children's lives. "You shouldn't be doing this alone," he finally said, his voice barely audible, and Lily looked up with eyes filled with aching hope. "We don't have anyone else," she said, and those 6 words shattered the last wall Ethan had built around his heart. He rose slowly, blinking back the sting in his eyes, then reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet, handing them bills they could barely comprehend. But even that didn't feel like enough. "Let me take you to the hospital," he offered, unsure if they'd trust him. "So you can see her." The girls exchanged a long look. Lacey asked, voice barely a breath, You'd do that for us?" Ethan nodded, kneeling again. "I promise. I'll help your mommy. I'll help you." They didn't speak, but slowly, Lily reached out and took his hand, small fingers wrapping around his palm as if testing its warmth, its truth. And in that instant, Ethan Blake, the untouchable CEO, felt more human than he had in decades. As the wind swirled around them and city noise resumed, the three of them stood in a fragile circle of newfound connection, a moment so delicate it felt like time itself had paused to witness it. Ethan glanced at the girls again, studying their faces, their expressions, their bright yet sorrowful eyes, and deep inside him a silent alarm began to ring, a whisper in his chest that these children weren't just a coincidence, they were part of something far more personal. But he didn't speak that fear yet. He only knew one thing: he couldn't walk away. Not from them. Not from their pain. Not this time. Something inside him had already chosen. Ethan gently reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a sleek black wallet, and without hesitation, placed a thick bundle of crisp bills into Lily's small hand, his fingers lingering there a moment, longer than they should have. As if silently transferring something heavier than money, hope, perhaps, or redemption he didn't yet understand. The girls gasped softly, not used to generosity, and certainly not from strangers in suits. "For all the donuts," Ethan said, voice low, "and for being so brave." Their eyes widened, as if the sun had peeked through a cloud they'd long thought permanent. But it wasn't the money that made them smile, it was the validation, the warmth in his tone, the simple act of someone seeing them as more than just charity. Lily handed him a donut, insisting he try one, her tiny fingers brushing his as she placed it in his palm. He looked down at the small pink frosted circle, then slowly took a bite. And the moment it touched his tongue, something inside him cracked. Not from the sweetness, though it was perfectly soft, but from the memories it unlocked. His eyes stung, breath hitching as an ache rose in his chest. The flavor reminded him of a different Timea kitchen filled with laughter, soft Sunday mornings with someone who once made the world feel still. He hadn't felt that way in years. Swallowing hard, he blinked fast, but it was no use. Eaters blurred his vision. He wiped his face quickly, hoping they wouldn't notice, but of course they did. Lacey leaned closer. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, tilting her head, her curls bouncing gently in the wind. Ethan nodded, but couldn't find his voice. Instead, he lowered himself onto the cold sidewalk beside them, his knees folding awkwardly under a life not built for humility, for pausing, for connection. Yet in that moment, sitting on dirty concrete beside two little girls in colorful frocks, Ethan Blake felt more grounded than he had in a decade of power and polished offices. "Do you like it?" Lily asked. Hopeful. He looked at her with tearful eyes and said, "It's the best thing I've tasted in a very long time." Both girls beamed, the kind of smile that could melt stone, and Ethan felt his heart stumble. They began to talk, slowly at first, but then with the eager cadence of children who had held in too much for too long. "Mommy taught us to bake," Lacey explained. "She says food can carry love if you put your heart in it." Lily nodded, adding, "She always said kindness is magic. And when you give it, it comes back." Ethan listened, mesmerized, each word like a drop of warmth thawing something frozen inside him. Kindness is magic. When had he stopped believing that? Maybe when his own heart was broken. Maybe when he chose money over meaning. Maybe when he lost someone he thought he'd never forget but tried to anyway. "Your mommy sounds special," he finally said, voice still raspy. "She is," Lily whispered, glancing at her sister with the kind of unspoken bond only twins shared. "She says the world isn't always kind, but that we should be anyway." Ethan looked away, unable to hold their gaze, because in their light he saw the shadow he had become. "Do you think kindness really comes back?" he asked, almost to himself. Lacey reached out and touched his sleeve gently. "You're here, aren't you?" That simple question knocked the wind from his chest. He laughed softly, then sobered, thinking about the people he'd stepped over, the calls he'd ignored, the love he'd walked away from. And now here he was, seated beside two strangers who somehow made him feel less like a stranger to himself. "We used to bake every Saturday," Lily said, eyes brightening, "and then we'd give donuts to the neighbors. Mommy said if people feel loved, they love more." Ethan nodded slowly, overwhelmed by the purity of that thought, how far it strayed from the business world he ruled with strategy and contracts. He studied their little scuffed, worn, slightly too small. Their dresses, bright but weathered. Their hands, sticky with frosting and bravery. And their hearts, so open, so trusting, even after being ignored and left in the cold. "You shouldn't have to do this," he said quietly. "We know," Lacey replied, "but we have to. She needs us." Ethan rested his hands on his knees, staring at the city around them, the towers of glass, the blaring horns, the indifferent sky, and felt something shift inside. For the first time in years, he didn't feel superior to it. He felt part of something again. The girls leaned against him, tired from the weight of the day, but still glowing with belief that the world, somehow, could still be good. And maybe, just maybe, he wanted to be part of proving them right. Ethan slowly stood up from the sidewalk, brushing frost and dust from his expensive slacks, though for the first time in his life he couldn't have cared less about appearances. His heart was still tangled in the courage and sorrow of the two small girls beside him, and as they looked up at him with hesitant eyes that had already seen too much, he found himself saying words that surprised even him. "Let me take you to her," he offered, his voice more gentle than it had been in years. The twins exchanged a long glance, their tiny brows furrowed with uncertainty, not because they doubted his kindness but because trusting strangers was a dangerous game they had learned far too young. Lily bit her lip, and Lacey tilted her head slightly, as if trying to read his soul. And maybe they did. Maybe children have a way of sensing hearts hidden beneath suits and titles. Slowly, Lily nodded, whispering, "Okay. But you promise we'll get to her?" Ethan kneeled once more, placing a hand over his heart. "I promise, sweetheart," he said, his voice trembling with something deeper than mere sympathy. As he led them to his sleek black car parked by the curb, the girls stared in awe, not because of the vehicle's luxury but because it felt like a spaceship to another world, a world where, maybe, just maybe, hope lived. He opened the back door, helping them inside with the care of someone unfamiliar with children yet moved by instincts he didn't know he had. As they slid onto the warm leather seats, Lacey reached out and grabbed his hand before he could close the door. Her fingers were small and cold, and her voice was barely more than a breath. "Please, don't let Mommy die." Her words lodged like a blade in Ethan's chest, and for a second, he couldn't breathe. He knelt beside the car and placed his other hand over hers. "I won't," he said, though deep down he knew he had no control over fate. Still, something in him believed those words with an aching desperation. He got in the front seat, started the engine, and as the car eased into motion, the silence inside was thick with unsaid fears. The city moved around them in a blur, honking horns, flashing lights, people rushing through lives unaware of the storm riding quietly through their streets. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the girls holding hands, their faces pale but composed, trying not to cry, trying to be strong. "How long has she been sick?" he asked softly. 3 weeks, Lily replied, but she didn't tell us until she couldn't stand anymore. Lacey added, "She kept saying it's just the flu, but then she collapsed." Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles whitening as a rush of guilt coursed through him, though he didn't understand why it felt so personal. "You shouldn't have to carry this," he muttered, more to himself. "She said we were born strong." Lily said with a ghost of a smile, "Like her." The girls leaned against each other, heads touching, and Ethan felt the car was now carrying more than passenger seat carried: history, pain, innocence, and something ancient and familiar he couldn't name. Every red light stretched longer than it should, every slow driver felt like an enemy of time. His mind raced. Where was this hospital? How bad was her condition? And why, every time he thought of their mother's name, did something inside him shift uncomfortably, like a door trying to remember being opened? "Did your mommy ever talk about your dad?" Ethan asked suddenly, unsure why the question escaped him. The girls grew quiet. Then, Lily whispered, "She said he was once her dream. But dreams can fade." Lacey added, "But she also said she never stopped loving him, even if he forgot her." Ethan's jaw clenched. He couldn't explain it, but every word they said felt like a mirror pointed at something buried deep in his past. "Do you remember his name?" he asked, barely audible. The girls looked at each other again, as if speaking a truth they'd been told never to say aloud. "She called him Ethan," Lily said quietly. His hands froze on the wheel, the breath sucked from his lungs like a vacuum had been turned on inside the car. He nearly missed the next turn, heart pounding, vision narrowing. "Ethan?" he asked, voice cracking. "Yes," Lacey confirmed, "like yours." But they didn't connect the dots, not yet. They were children. They weren't looking for a father in a stranger. They were looking for a miracle. Ethan swallowed the thunder in his throat, forced himself to drive, forced himself not to pull over and collapse under the weight of what he suspected. Could it be? Could fate be this cruel? Or this miraculous? The hospital sign appeared ahead like a beacon in a storm, and Ethan's pulse beat louder than the engine beneath them. He reached back without looking, and both girls held his hand without hesitation this time. They didn't know what he was thinking, but somehow, they trusted that he was taking them somewhere safer than they'd been in weeks. And as the car rolled to a stop beneath the hospital's emergency entrance awning, Ethan realized that the storm they were heading into wasn't the one outside, it was the one inside him, unraveling every truth he thought he knew. As the car came to a gentle halt under the emergency room canopy, Ethan stepped out first, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with unusual urgency, heart pounding louder than the city's sirens. He swung open the back door and gently helped the twins down, their small hands gripping his fingers as tightly as if he were the only thread holding their world together. Without waiting, he scooped them into his arms and burst through the sliding doors of the hospital, no longer a man of calculated steps but a storm of purpose. The nurses at the front desk looked up in surprise as he approached, the sharp click of his shoes announcing both power and desperation. "Where is the billing department?" he asked briskly, voice strained. "The children's mother Emily Grace is under care here. I want to clear everything she owes. Every cent." The woman at the counter blinked, startled, then called someone urgently. Moments later, a billing administrator emerged, and Ethan handed over a black card without asking for the amount. "Run it," he said. "Now." The administrator's eyes widened at the numbers on the screen but said nothing, simply nodding and disappearing with reverent haste. A moment later, confirmation printed out on the machine, and the nurse exhaled visibly. She was hours from being removed from ICU priority, the nurse admitted softly, her expression softening. "You just saved her treatment plan." Lily covered her mouth as tears spilled from her wide blue eyes, and Lacey wrapped both arms around Ethan's waist as if clinging to a lighthouse in the middle of a dark sea. He bent slightly, pressing a hand to each of their backs, grounding himself in their warmth, though his insides trembled. He had acted swiftly, instinctively, and only now did the pieces begin to shift with chilling clarity. "Emily Grace," he repeated, more to himself than anyone else, tasting the name like a ghost on his tongue. The world around him blurred, the busy nurses, the calls over the intercom, the antiseptic smell of the air all faded as that name echoed louder and louder in his soul. His lips parted slightly, his throat going dry as if the syllables had sucked the oxygen from the room. Emily Grace. The woman he once loved with a fire so fierce it nearly devoured him. The woman who vanished from his life without explanation, without goodbye, taking something with her that he never managed to replace. 6 years. 6 whole years he'd buried her memory under boardroom deals, cold sheets, and endless silence, and now she was here. Dying. Alone. Her daughter's daughters? Selling donuts on the street while he built glass towers and forgot how to feel. The ground beneath him seemed to tilt, a nauseating dizziness climbing up his spine as his thoughts scattered like glass. Emily Grace, he whispered again, as if repeating it would somehow lessen the blow. He looked down at the girls beside him, same eyes, same fire, same soft strength. How could he have not seen it before? "Can I see her?" he asked the nurse, barely keeping his voice steady. "She's sedated in ICU," the nurse replied gently. She was unresponsive earlier, but now stable thanks to the payment. Lacey tugged his sleeve, voice small but urgent. "Can we go to her now, please? I want to hold her hand." Ethan nodded, unable to speak as emotion built behind his eyes like a dam threatening to burst. The nurse led them down the hallway, and with every step, memories ambushed him, laughter in the rain, coffee in bed, the moment he told her he wasn't ready for marriage, the argument that burned too hot, the silence that followed for years. Had she tried to reach him? Had he ignored her voice without knowing what was at stake? They turned a corner, and the sterile walls seemed to close in as the ICU doors approached. Ethan placed a hand on each twin's shoulder, grounding them as much as himself. "I need you to be strong," he whispered, but it sounded more like a plea to his own heart. The doors hissed open, and a nurse motioned toward the last room. Ethan's breath caught as he stepped in. There, surrounded by humming machines and soft beeps, lay Emily. Her face, though pale, was unmistakable. Even in stillness, she was radiant. Her hair was pulled back, her hands motionless atop white sheets, an oxygen line under her nose, monitors tracking the fragile rhythm of a life too close to fading. Lily gasped, running to the bedside. "Mommy!" she cried softly, grabbing her limp fingers. Lacey joined her, placing her head gently on the edge of the bed, whispering, "We're here, don't go, Mommy, please." Ethan stood frozen, knees threatening to buckle, hands trembling at his sides. He had imagined her 100 ways over the years, angry, married, far away, but never like this. Never fighting to breathe. Never surrounded by children he never knew he had. His eyes flooded with tears, and for the first time in years, he let them fall freely, not as a man. Not as a CEO. But as someone who had loved and lost and may now lose again. He stepped forward, each inch a battle, until he reached the side of the bed and touched the back of her hand. It was warm, but lifeless. And in that touch, the years collapsed. All the silence. All the what-ifs. All the time wasted. Emily. He whispered, voice cracking. It's me. His hand hovered just above hers, trembling, afraid to rest fully upon it, as if physical contact might confirm what his heart already feared. Ethan stared down at Emily's still face, her pale skin touched by the sterile light above, and every breath he took felt heavier, like inhaling memories instead of air. A whirlwind of questions flooded his mind. Choking logic with emotion. How could this be her? How had she fallen so far, vanished so completely from his world only to reappear like this, broken and surrounded by monitors? He stepped back, his chest tightening, his legs unsteady as he leaned against the wall outside her ICU room, pressing the heel of his hand to his forehead like it might stop the flood of memories clawing back through the years. And then, as if the air around him turned to glass, the past shattered open. He was no longer standing in a hospital hallway, but pulled back in time, back to the days when Emily's laughter filled his apartment like sunshine on winter mornings, when her head fit perfectly beneath his chin, as they danced barefoot in the kitchen, when she told him she believed in him more than anyone ever had. He remembered the smell of her lavender shampoo, the way she folded her notes and tucked them into his briefcase before big meetings, the countless times she whispered, "Don't forget what matters, Ethan." But back then, he did forget. He remembered how quickly ambition swallowed his better judgment, how easily he traded tenderness for titles. There had been arguments at first about time, then about attention, and finally about whether he truly saw a future with her. One night, after a particularly cold fight, he walked out to attend a late investor dinner. When he came back hours later, she was gone. No note. No goodbye. Just an empty closet and a silence that screamed. He had searched at first half-heartedly, angrily convinced she'd overreacted. But months turned into years, and pride told him she'd moved on. That she didn't want to be found. That she'd given up on him as he buried himself deeper in a world where feelings were liabilities. But now, standing outside that room, hearing machines monitor her breath, he realized the truth was far crueler. She hadn't left to forget him, she had left to protect something. Or someone. His eyes darted to the twins, who now sat quietly in plastic chairs by the nurse's station, their small fingers intertwined, their expressions exhausted but calm. Blue eyes. Curly hair. That soft tremble in the lip when they spoke. How had he not seen it sooner? He collapsed into a chair across from the ICU door, head in his hands, heart hammering like a war drum. Could it be? Could those girls, those sweet, hurting girls, be his? His daughters. The weight of the possibility pressed into his chest like a boulder. 6 years ago, Emily had vanished. 6 years ago, his world lost color. 6 years ago, those girls were born. The timeline lined up like puzzle pieces that had always been there, waiting for him to finally care enough to assemble them. He remembered something Lacey had said in the car. She said he was her dream, but dreams can fade. And Lily's hesitant words. She never stopped loving him, even if he forgot her. He hadn't forgotten, he'd just been too blind to see where to look. A lump formed in his throat, bitter with guilt. What kind of man misses his own children growing up? What kind of heart lets that happen without knowing? But then again, hadn't he built walls precisely to avoid feeling anything? And now that those walls were crumbling, the truth was too loud to ignore. He looked up again at the ICU door and knew that behind it was not just the woman he had once loved, it was the family he never knew he had. Rising slowly, he paced the hallway like a man possessed, haunted by flashbacks of moments he didn't know he'd missed: first steps, birthdays, bedtime stories, tears wiped by hands that should have been his. The pain was unbearable, but what terrified him more was the uncertainty of what came next. If she woke up, would she hate him? Would she allow him near them? Would she forgive him for being absent from the most sacred moments of her life? Or would she see him only as the man who chose ambition over affection? His thoughts spiraled until he could hardly see straight. He pressed his palm to the glass window of her door, staring at the still rise and fall of her chest. "Emily," he whispered under his breath, "why didn't you tell me?" But the silence that answered was the same one he'd created all those years ago. It wasn't her job to chase him. He should have listened. Should have cared more. Should have fought harder. And now it might be too late. He turned to glance at the girls again, who were now curled up beside each other, dozing off in exhaustion. His heart shattered at the sight. He had missed everything. But maybe, just maybe, if she opened her eyes. If she gave him even the smallest chance, he could try to fix what time had broken. Ethan stood motionless for a breath that seemed to stretch across all the lost years, his hand still pressed against the glass of the ICU door, his heart pounding so loud he could hear nothing else, only feel the weight of everything he had never said. Then, like gravity reclaiming him, he pushed the door open slowly, almost reverently, like stepping into sacred ground. The low hum of machines and rhythmic beeping greeted him like a mournful melody, the sterile scent of antiseptic and metal clinging to the air, but all he could see was her Emily, fragile, pale, and still achingly beautiful despite the battle her body was clearly fighting. Her once radiant skin now held a quiet grayness, her dark lashes resting delicately against her cheeks, and the faint rise and fall of her chest was the only proof that life still held her. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, just stared as tears welled uncontrollably, streaking down his cheeks without shame. Then, with trembling steps, he moved to her side, slowly reaching for the hand that used to fit so naturally in his. When his fingers wrapped around hers, a current of memory rushed through him, laughter echoing down hallways, whispers under midnight sheets, the warmth of promises they never got to keep. He knelt beside her, unable to stay standing, and pressed her hand gently to his forehead. "Emily," he breathed, broken and bare. "It's me, Ethan." At first, there was only the sound of machines and the soft hush of oxygen flowing, but then like the gentlest ripple on still water her eyes fluttered. He held his breath, heart suspended in the chasm between hope and despair. Her lids lifted slowly, and the first thing she saw was Himmler, wearier, but unmistakably the man she had once loved. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with disbelief, as if reality had played a cruel trick and placed a ghost beside her bed. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice so faint it barely registered, and a fresh wave of tears surged down his face. He nodded desperately, his grip tightening slightly on her hand as if to tether her to the moment. "I'm here," he said. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't." But she cut through his guilt with just 3 words that shattered what was left of his heart. "You found them." Her lips trembled, and tears slid from the corners of her eyes, joining his in a shared flood of pain, relief, and fragile reconnection. "Yes," he choked out, "they're here, they're safe." Her eyes blinked hard, trying to stay open, trying to focus, the weight of 6 silent years pressing behind her gaze. "I tried to. I didn't want them to grow up, without knowing love." Her words cracked with effort, and Ethan leaned in closer, his forehead brushing the edge of the bed. "They do know love, Emily, because they had you. And know if you'll let me, I want to be part of it too." Her eyes filled again, not just with pain but with something deeper, recognition, maybe even forgiveness. "You were always the only one," she whispered. "Even when you forgot me." Ethan broke completely then, burying his face beside her hand, his sobs silent but earth-shaking. "I didn't forget," he managed between breaths. "I buried it, because I thought I'd lost you forever." Her fingers, weak but determined, moved just enough to brush through his hair, a gesture so familiar it felt like time had folded in on itself. "They have your eyes," she said, her lips curving into the faintest smile despite the tears. "I told them, one day their daddy would find them." Ethan lifted his head, eyes red, voice raw. "You were right." He stood slowly and motioned to the nurse by the door. A moment later, the girls tiptoed in, clutching each other's hands, unsure but hopeful. When Emily saw them, her breath hitched and her whole body seemed to awaken with maternal instinct. "My babies," she whispered, arms barely lifting. The twins rushed to her, climbing gently onto the bed, one curling at her side, the other resting her head on Emily's shoulder. Ethan watched, standing just behind, and for the first time in years, he witnessed something pure, his family, broken but not beyond repair. He reached forward, placing his hand on Emily's shoulder, and the other on his daughter's backs. In that moment, the sterile room became sacred, a space where time, regret, and lost years bowed to something greater: reunion, forgiveness, and love that never truly died. Emily closed her eyes again, not from weakness, but from peace. And Ethan, no longer a man running from his past, stood as the protector of a future he never thought he'd have. The stillness in the room shattered like fragile glass beneath Emily's trembling voice as she looked at the girls nestled beside her and whispered, "They're yours, Ethan." The words landed like thunder in his chest, not loud, but all-consuming, echoing through every chamber of his heart that had been locked for years. He staggered back a step, as if the floor beneath him had tilted, hands shaking as he caught the edge of a chair to keep from falling. His gaze shifted from Emily's weary face to the innocent eyes of the two girls curled against her eyes that were no longer just beautiful, no longer just kind, they were his. The curve of their cheeks, the slope of their noses, even the way their brows lifted when confused, it all mirrored pieces of a past he had thought buried. His entire world paused, as though time itself bowed in respect to the enormity of the truth just spoken aloud. "They're mine?" he whispered, voice cracking beneath the weight of emotion. Emily nodded gently, her hand brushing back Lacey's hair with the tenderness only a mother could give. "I was already pregnant the night we last fought," she confessed, tears falling freely. "But you were so far gone into your world of deadlines and deals. I didn't want them to grow up feeling like second place." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs like a punch, his soul crashing against the realization of how much he'd missed. Birthdays. First words. Their tiny arms reaching for comfort he was never there to give. All the while, he sat in boardrooms. Chasing legacy, blind to the living legacy that bore his blood. "I have daughters," he whispered again, as if saying it might help him believe it. "I'm a father." His knees finally gave way and he sank beside the bed, both hands now reaching for the small ones resting on the blanket. The girls looked up at him with wonder. There was no blame in their gaze, only cautious hope, like hearts testing the water before deciding to swim. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Emily, his voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes welled again. "I tried. I wrote letters. I even came to your office once, but your assistant sent me away. I didn't want to beg to be seen." Ethan closed his eyes in shame, remembering the coldness he had built like armor, the silence he once mistook for strength. "You were the only thing that ever made me feel real," she continued softly. "And when I lost you, I promised I'd give them all the love we lost. But I never stopped wondering if one day you'd see them, and know." His heart cracked deeper with each word, but the final blow came not from guilt but from the sudden tightness of tiny arms wrapping around his shoulders. Lacey had climbed into his lap, pressing her cheek into his neck. "Are you really our daddy?" she asked, so quietly it nearly broke him. He nodded slowly, tears spilling again as he held her close. "Yes, sweetheart. I am. I didn't know. But now I do, and I promise I'll never let you go." Lily joined, crawling over her sister and squeezing him from the other side. "Mommy said you used to sing to the stars," she said, her voice shaking. "Will you sing to us too?" He choked on a sob, nodding through the ache in his chest. "I will, baby. Every night if you want." Emily watched, her hand pressed to her lips, overwhelmed by the image of the man she once loved now transformed, now broken open in the best way as he finally met the family he never knew he needed. "I was so afraid," Ethan admitted, lifting his eyes to meet hers. "Afraid I'd ruined everything. That I didn't deserve them, or you." She reached for his hand, her grip weak but steady. "It's not about what we deserve, Ethan, it's about what we choose now." The girls settled into his lap, their heads resting against his chest, small heartbeats thudding against the rhythm of his own. He kissed the top of each of their heads, memorizing their scent, their softness, their warmth. In that moment, the weight of wealth, status, and legacy fell away like dust. None of it mattered. Not compared to this. Not compared to being the arms they could fall asleep in, the voice they could call daddy, the man who would now move heaven and earth to protect them. He turned back to Emily, his voice thick but sure, "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I'm staying. For them. For you. For us." Her eyes shimmered, not with pain now, but with the fragile beginnings of peace. And as the hospital monitors beeped softly behind them, marking the rhythm of life, a new heartbeat began to grow on, stitched from truth, from forgiveness, and from love rediscovered too late, but just in time. The silence that followed Ethan's vow was no longer filled with grief or regret, it pulsed with quiet promise, with a warmth that had been missing far too long. That very evening, without hesitation or delay. Ethan made arrangements for Emily's transfer to the best private suite in the hospital, a room filled not only with the hum of cutting-edge equipment but with the renewed presence of hope. As Emily slept peacefully under soft lights and warm blankets, no longer just another patient but now a woman finally protected, Ethan remained by her side, not as a visitor, not as a stranger, but as the man who had found his way back to the very place his soul once called home. Doctors came and went with quiet reverence, nurses began to smile more brightly when they entered the room, and the air inside no longer felt sterile, it felt sacred. While Emily recovered slowly but steadily, Ethan poured every resource into creating a world where she would not just survive, but truly heal. He brought in specialists to reassess her condition, hired a soft-spoken private nurse who treated her like royalty, and handpicked every item in the room, from the fresh white roses on the nightstand to the classical music gently filling the space. But his care didn't stop at Emily. His heart now belonged just as fiercely to the two little girls who had changed everything. He took them shopping himself, holding one in each hand as they wandered through aisles of soft dresses, sparkly shoes, cozy jackets, and stuffed animals that looked too big for their tiny arms. For the first time in years, Ethan laughed not for business, not for show, but because joy bloomed effortlessly in the presence of their wonder. He carried their bags himself, knelt when they asked questions, wiped their noses when they sniffled, and kissed their foreheads as naturally as if he'd done it since birth. Back at the hospital, he transformed the sitting area outside Emily's room into a temporary nursery, colorful blankets, a low table for coloring books, a plush reading chair, and a shelf lined with bedtime stories. He ordered warm meals every day: chicken soup, fluffy pancakes, cheesy macaroni, and sat cross-legged on the floor as the girls giggled between bites, sometimes feeding him too just to make him smile. And he did. He smiled more in those few days than he had in the last 6 years combined. But more powerful than the material comfort he offered, was the restoration of something deeper: the sense of being wanted, known, and loved. The girls no longer tiptoed when they walked. They laughed out loud. They held his hands as they walked through the halls and snuggled into his arms without hesitation when the day grew long. They asked him stories about when he was little, gasped at every tale, and corrected him when he made silly mistakes on purpose. One afternoon, as the golden sun filtered through the windows and cast a soft glow over the room, Lacey sat beside Ethan with her arms full of dolls and whispered, "I think Daddy came from the sky." Ethan chuckled, eyes sparkling, "Oh really?" She nodded confidently. "Because Mommy said angels come when we need them most." He felt a lump rise in his throat, but before he could speak, Lily chimed in, arms crossed playfully. "No, Mommy said Daddy would find us one day." That's what happened. Ethan reached out and pulled them both into his arms, holding them close against his chest, his voice tender as he whispered, "I think you both found me too." Emily watched all of it from her bed, smiling now, color returning to her cheeks, strength slowly blooming back into her voice. And though she said little, the way her eyes followed every moment between Ethan and the girls revealed a heart no longer burdened by fear or resentment. Forgiveness had arrived quietly, hand in hand with love. Every time she opened her eyes and saw them together, the broken pieces of her past softened just a little more. Ethan never left the hospital, not for meetings, not for phone calls, not even for sleep. His assistant handled everything remotely, and when investors grew impatient, he told them, "Family comes first now. I'm finally learning what that means." He spent his nights in the recliner beside Emily, sometimes dozing off with one of the girls curled up on his chest, sometimes staying awake just to watch his daughters breathe, as if afraid he'd blink and wake from the dream. Slowly, the cold armor that had once defined him as a CEO melted away, revealing not a man weakened by emotion but one made whole by it. He read bedtime stories until the girls' eyelids fluttered closed, braided their hair in the morning with clumsy fingers and determination, and even let them draw hearts on his cheeks with pink marker, earning grins from every passing nurse. But above all, he listened. He listened when they talked about their favorite colors, their dreams, their nightmares, their memories of Mommy singing lullabies when they had nothing but soup to share. And he listened when Emily finally opened up about the years of struggle, nights spent coughing in shelters, days working odd jobs while hiding her illness, the silent pain of watching the girls grow without their father, and the moments she'd whisper his name while they slept, hoping somehow he'd hear. Ethan never interrupted. He just held her hand and cried with her, his heart finally understanding the depth of what had been lost and what he now vowed never to lose again. The days that followed bloomed like spring after a cruel winter, as if the universe itself had taken a breath and begun again. Emily's recovery was no longer measured in beeping monitors or slow heartbeats but in the way her laughter returned like a forgotten melody, soft at first, then stronger, echoing through hospital halls and curling around the hearts of those who had waited too long to hear it. Her cheeks glowed with color, her hands regained strength, and her voice, once trembling, now carried the warmth of a mother reclaiming her world. Discharged into a peaceful estate nestled just beyond the city, she arrived not as a patient, but as a queen returning home surrounded by love, not fear. The home Ethan had once built to impress investors now transformed into a sanctuary for four. Each corner filled with toys, laughter, warmth, and the gentle hum of second chances. The girls danced barefoot across hardwood floors, their giggles trailing through the hallways like sunshine, while Ethan and Emily shared glances that spoke of everything once lost and now returned. And then, on a quiet evening, beneath a sky streaked in watercolor hues, they found themselves together in the blooming garden behind the house, surrounded by lavender, lilies, and the scent of a life reborn. Emily sat in a wicker chair beneath the arbor, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes reflecting twilight as she watched her daughters chase fireflies under the canopy of stars. Ethan stood beside her, silent at first, then reached down to take her hand in his, this time not to beg forgiveness, but to promise a future. She looked up and smiled, her fingers lacing through his, and together they watched the girls finally pause, breathless and glowing. He took a slow step forward, then another, before kneeling in front of them, his eyes level with theirs, no longer the towering figure of a businessman, but the gentle, present heart of a father reborn. His voice cracked only slightly as he said, "I wasn't there before, and I can never give you back those days, but I'm here now, and I will be. Every day. Always." For a moment, they just stared, those same blue eyes, wide and shining, searching for something only love could confer. Then they launched forward, wrapping their arms around his neck, their little bodies pressing into him with all the weight of their fragile hearts. "We know, Daddy," Lily whispered against his ear. "You came back." Lacey nodded through tears, her voice muffled by his jacket. "And we're never letting go." Ethan held them close, his heart flooding with something he had never known in boardrooms or beneath skyscraper lights, a sense of worth no title could offer. Behind them, Emily rose slowly and joined the embrace, one arm around each child, the other around the man who had once broken her heart, now holding the pieces with reverence. No words were spoken in that moment, but they didn't need to be. The silence was full of forgiveness, of healing, of hope. As twilight gave way to the soft hush of night, Ethan reached for their hands, gently intertwining fingers with Emily's and each of the girls, their family bound now not by blood alone, but by choice. With slow steps, they began walking down the garden path, four shadows stretching together beneath the stars, guided not by the past but by the light of what could still be. Behind them, the wind whispered through the trees like a lullaby, carrying away the last remnants of loneliness. And as the camera panned back, fading into the soft glow of lantern light and starlit sky, the final image remained, a family once torn by silence now united in love, moving forward not perfect, but whole into a future rewritten by grace, kindness, and the unbreakable bond of finding each other again, just in time.